from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
A very good morning to you. This is the Saturday Breakfast Show here on Teachers Talk Radio. It is Saturday, the 30th of May, 2026. My name is Darren Lester, and we will be here for the next 90 minutes having a chat about whether the way that we design our tasks in class for both testing and just general getting them to do something in their books purposes can limit the cheating that is going on. So that is what is on the ticker today. I hope that it is a topic that you will find interesting, as interesting as I found researching it anyway. And yeah, that's where we're going. But first of all, before we get into that, how are you? How has your week been? Have you survived / enjoyed the heat? I was probably very naive in not expecting it, quite frankly. I don't know what I was expecting, given that it is May. I know it's still technically spring, but it's summer, let's be honest. But yeah, it came as a bit of a shock, not gonna lie. And I saw a map yesterday of the what are they calling it, the heat dome or something, and sort of how it affected different points in Europe. And we seemed to be right at the center of it. It was one of those really nice kind of, colored in weather maps where we had a nice bit of red where it was hot. It kind of got green where it was not so much. And we were a very vivid shade of purple. It was kind of the UK and the top of France were, a very deep purple. So we had it the worst by the looks of it, or the best, I suppose, depending on your viewpoint of the weather, of the heat. For me personally, not a fan. I must say, not a fan. Oh, actually, that's a really bad pun, isn't it? Given how intensely I've been using my fan this week. But yeah, the heat is not for me. I don't want to be one of those people that moans about the weather, ironically enough, given that that's what I'm doing, because I am aware that lots of people enjoy it. I know that lots of people have been really into it over the past few days, which is great. I am not going to yuck that yum, because I've just had however many months it has been of the cold and the wet, which is my preferred. So I will let everybody have what they enjoy. But yeah, I am looking forward to the suggested cool down, although I must admit I've not actually checked the weather lately. I've been a bit scared too. But yeah, the fan has been doing its job. It has been working overtime. I've been very grateful to realize that the kind of voice isolation on my microphone blocks the fan noise out, because I've kind of just been turning it off during my lessons. I've been teaching this week because, just in case you are new to the show, just in case you don't know, I teach in an online school, so we don't follow the same kind of school year as everybody else. We're essentially year round, and as teachers, we just take our holidays whenever we want them, whenever we need them. We just let our students know there will be no lessons in whatever given week. So I've been teaching this week because we actually have our next GCSE Latin exam on Tuesday. So I thought it was important to keep my lessons going through this week. And there was one random lesson midweek where I forgot to turn the fan off. And I then mentioned it, and my pupils were like, "Oh, no, don't worry, we can't hear anything." So I was grateful for that feedback. I was grateful to know that the voice isolation on my mic does actually work. But I was also really annoyed at myself for not realizing that earlier on in the week when it was actually boiling in the office. But you live and learn. You live and learn. That was my bit of CPD for that day. But other than that, I have had a decent week. It has been an interesting one. Again, in the news, we have been seeing more stuff coming out from the DFE and their interesting social media strategy at the moment. Again, I can't, no, I'm about to be a massive hypocrite, because I did, in case you have seen the post that went out on the TTR social media, I made my feelings very known in that LinkedIn comment about how I really hate that millennial social media marketing intern versus the Gen Z one. I really don't like that meme because I think it's really insulting to millennials and to Gen Z people. But I also don't think that the Department for Education should be jumping on memes because I'm not entirely sure who they think they are advertising to. And I think this is the crux of the issue that I have, with what's been going on with all of that. Hiring JC to talk about educational matters, that's a choice. Well, I say hiring. To her credit, she did not get paid for doing those adverts. She's done them voluntarily because clearly this is an issue that she cares about, and I respect that. I have pointed out the irony to anybody who will listen that one of the big issues that we have as teachers is fair pay or lack thereof, and then the DFE is getting social media stars to do their social media stuff for them unpaid. And then, you listen to her video clips and she's talking about how she liked school. She wanted to do well in school, didn't do very well in maths. That's kind of all I've learned from that social media campaign. I had even forgotten that you could get a grade G. So, at least it's kind of reawoken that knowledge in me. But I don't feel like I've learned anything about what the Department for Education is trying to do, or what any of the upcoming reforms are, or anything really. So I'm kind of assuming that I, as the teacher, am not the audience for this particular campaign. I know that a lot of the parents in the kind of SEN parent community have been upset because there have been reforms, there have been changes. They feel like they are not being heard. They feel like they're not being listened to. So I'm not entirely sure that they are the right audience. It doesn't seem to be that trainees and potential trainees are the audience, because I've not heard anything about training yet. So I'm not actually sure what the message is, and I'm not sure what they're trying to achieve, and I'm if you look at my social media, you will know that I am not a social media guru. I don't know how to advertise myself. I don't know how to even my show. I'm not very good at reminding people to tune in. Sort of after I've done my initial, this is what this week's show is about. So I am in no position to speak on this. But yeah, I don't know what the messaging is, and so I kind of don't know what the point is. What I'm kind of hoping is that the point is to get people talking about the message. I sort of hope that that's not the case, because it then means that we are making everything that the DFE is currently doing into figures of fun, and I don't like that idea. But I do like the idea that maybe they've deliberately gone a little bit over the top so that they just get people talking about them. I really, really don't know. Tim has messaged in, good morning to you, to say you'd think they'd learn from a head teacher telling off Starmer for 6-7ing in her classroom. This is also fair. That was really interesting, I think, because doing something like that is a really nice way to build rapport with children. Children think it's quite funny when adults get told off. And they also think it's funny when we meme. If I remember that particular incident correctly, the children were young enough to legitimately find it funny that that's what he was doing, instead of kind of laughing at him for doing it and cringing that he was using one of their memes, as older children might do. Um, so with that in mind, I actually quite liked that, because for me it hit quite well as an adult, knowing what he was doing to kind of get the children, in inverted commas, on side. Um, Whether or not it was worth the time and whatever money was spent to kind of get that clip to go viral, I don't know. Um, I suppose, and this is a question for the social media marketers, for the school marketing teams, for the DFE's marketing team, I suppose, about whether, as educators, we should hold ourselves to a different standard, whether we should be stooping, I suppose, because that's what it feels like, to virality, to social media marketing. Or whether, in the same way that we have to hold ourselves to different standards in our professional lives and in our personal lives, if you look at part B of the teaching standards, there are ways that we as the teachers are expected to behave, are expected to portray ourselves, so that we don't, in inverted commas, bring the profession into disrepute. It kind of then rankles a little bit when you see the Department for Education, the people who are supposed to be in charge of us, the people telling us that we're not allowed to make fun of the profession, doing that very same thing. I don't know. Part of me really hopes that I'm just a bit of old man yelling at the sky, and because I don't understand social media marketing, I'm missing something, and I really, really hope that I'm wrong, and that whatever we are trying to do, whatever the DFE is trying to do, is working. Um, but yeah, I don't know. From conversations I've had with my colleagues, from conversations that I have had with other teachers, I don't know. So it will be interesting to see. It will be interesting to see. I just wish somebody would tell me what the point of it was. I wish somebody would just say, this is what we are trying to do. We are trying to raise awareness that the Department for Education exists. We are trying to raise awareness of the new vocational qualifications, because that's what I thought the point was originally, that we've got these new vocational qualifications launching, and they were trying to make sure that people know that that's an option. But I don't actually think I've seen any discussion of that anywhere. Um, Maybe they're just trying to raise awareness of education in general, but that seems a bit pointless because we all know that education exists. I don't know. And to me, that feels a bit like it's a failed marketing scheme. If I, as a teacher, as somebody involved in education, as somebody who should feel represented by this department, doesn't actually know what the point is, what they are trying to get at. Tom, who is somebody that I would say is a social media expert. Tom is very, very good with the social media. He knows what he's doing. He knows how to use social media to bring teachers together and to raise awareness of teaching issues. So if you're not following, well, first of all, if you're not following Tom, I'm not entirely sure why, given that he is Teachers Talk Radio. He is our CEO and our founder, and without him we wouldn't be here. So if you're not following him, go ahead and give him a follow. But if you are already following him, as I would say pretty much every teacher in the country at this point must be, if you look at his stats, if you look at his views. Oh, I am being disputed right now. Um, but yeah, if you're not following him, please do, because he raises awareness of all sorts of really interesting things, and brings to yeah, brings things across. Sorry, I am now just reading comments, forgetting that I'm actually hosting a show. But yeah, do go on over and check out what he is saying, what he is talking about. If as Tim and Tom, that's really hard to say, have done, you want to get involved in the conversation this morning, there are a few ways that you can do so. When we finally get onto our topic of whether or not we think that we can change the way that we design our tasks to eliminate cheating, there are a couple of ways that you can do so. You can leave comments. If you are listening live on YouTube or on X, you can just message me right there. I love this because they appear in this handy little pane on my screen, and I just need to click a button and then you can read them. It's brilliant. So you can do that. If you are listening to me on playback, so if you are listening via the podcast version of this show, then you can get in touch with me over on Blue Sky. I am at Mr. D. Lester. Please don't DM me because I haven't yet scanned my face so that I can receive my DMs, and I don't actually plan to do so, to be honest. So just tag me a message and we can have a chat, because as I always say, the stuff that we talk about here on Saturday mornings are things that I'm always interested in. So even if it is currently 2029 and you have just found this show, first of all, thank you. And second of all, message me anyway, because I will still want to talk about cheating and task design.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week covers news that academies in a 24-school MAT are to transition to other chains as Department for Education plans one of the biggest ever trust closures. The ATLP MAT has a large 7-figure deficit, has faced staff walkouts across many of its schools, announced redundancies, and its CEO has resigned. The DFE has stated that all the Trust's academies should now move to a small number of high-performing regionally based MATs. A spokesperson for the ATLP said that whilst financial progress had been made, it had not been enough. TES magazine says Ofsted will update its toolkits to clarify its approach to disadvantage. The move comes amid criticism that schools with more disadvantaged intakes are less likely to hit expected standard on achievement. This trend is confirmed in published figures showing 43% of schools with an above average proportion of pupils on free school meals fell below the expected standard, compared with 16% of schools with a below average number of free school meal pupils. From next month, Ofsted will make it clear that when looking at whether a school is at expected, the attainment of free school meal pupils is compared with that of free school meal pupils in other schools rather than with overall national averages. Union response and further details can be found on TES. The BBC says that the Department for Education has received backlash over its collaboration with TV reality personality Gemma Collins to promote post-16 education on social media. People questioning the inclusion of The Only Way is Essex star and Send campaigners angry with government spending on provision for pupils have been the most critical. Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson has responded to the negative comments as outright snobbery and as downright unpleasant, and argued that Collins had a reach that politicians can't. The BBC says that Collins chose to collaborate with the Department for Education in order to highlight alternative options for young people who feel university is not for them. Finally, the government announced on its website that children with SEND were at the forefront of discussions at the launch of the Education World Forum, as the Education Secretary launched a new international SEND alliance. In a speech, she called on countries to join an alliance of nations to share experiences, proven approaches, and agree clear actions in a shared mission to deliver opportunity for all children with SEND. Full details can be found on the government website. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
See, Joe knew what the point of the DFE campaign was, to promote post-16 education. There we go. Still waiting, in my opinion, for that to happen, but I'm sure that there will be a reel, a short, a TikTok, not a Vine. We are still lamenting the death of Vine, coming in the very near future to talk about post-16 education. Although, and I promise we will get on to talking about cheating and task design in a second, but for me, this raises a really interesting conversation about, and I have spoken about this on the show before, but about the anti-intellectualization of the education system. Because it seems to me, and I recognize that I am somebody who has been very privileged to go through university. I'm the first person in my family to get any kind of degree, and I'm now trying to take it as far as I can. So, you know, I do have a bias in favor of universities. And I also recognize that we are in a time where kind of going to university seems to be just the next step for all pupils. I'm not sure that I've actually taught anybody in the last 15 years for whom there was even a question about whether they would go to university. It was just like, yes, Mr. Lester, I'm going to uni, but what do you think I should study? As opposed to, do you think I should go to university? So, you know, I am aware that we need to make sure that everybody knows what all of their options are. And I do think that bringing in vocational qualifications and making sure that people know that these vocational qualifications exist is a great idea. But I also think that we spend a lot of time talking about vocational qualifications, and we spend a lot of time talking about the non-academic routes through post-16 education and training. And we don't actually spend a lot of time talking about the academic ones, making sure that children are making the right choice for them and supporting those academic students through that process of academic university courses or A-level so that they can get into the universities. And I feel like kind of by pushing those aside and by always focusing on the non-academic routes, or at least shining more awareness on the non-academic routes, because we kind of assume that children who are going to go to university are going to go to university, so they don't need these messages spelled out for them. We kind of downplay the importance of academia, the importance of discovering new things, creating new knowledge, and kind of what you can do if you do push your knowledge as far as possible. Now, this is quite relevant. It's quite pertinent to conversations that we've been having here on Teachers Talk Radio this week. And in fact, I'm going to refer you over to points of view from Tuesday. We had a midweek points of view this week, where the points of view team were discussing the new research that has come out that talks about how so many of our young people are not going into education or training, you know, be that post 16, post 18, whatever it might be, at all of these crucial kind of key stages, if you like. We've got people who are sort of dropping out of the system. We're not quite at the same place that Japan is with its hikikomori culture, but it looks like we're getting there. And kind of in relevance to that, I saw something just yesterday about somebody who is getting a master's degree, but he thinks that when he's got his degree, he will become one of those neat people, not in education, employment, or training, because he doesn't know what to do next. And I think that that is a really important conversation for us to have, not about employability and not about you need to get this degree so that you can get this job, but about what actually does happen to us when the degrees are over. What do we do with the knowledge that we have collected? What is the point of it? Because I think the more that we just treat going to university as the natural next step, the less likely we are to know, or the less likely our young people are to know what to do with that afterwards. And so then they get a bit lost. But anyway, the points of view team talk about it much more succinctly and much more knowledgeably than I have just there. So the QR code, if you are watching or listening live, that I've just popped up on the screen for you, that will take you over to that show. Please, again, don't abandon me for the show. I promise I will be interesting, but maybe just give it a scan, hit the pause button, and then you can give it a listen once we are done here. So we are talking about, finally getting to the point, we are talking about whether we can limit cheating in task design. Now, I'm going to start with the only thing that I'm going to say about AI in this whole show, and then I will not talk about it, I promise, because I'm sure you are all sick of me and my anti-AI stance by now. But I think we can't deny that we've seen a rise in cheating, or at least we are talking more about cheating these days than we ever have before, in response to children becoming more proficient with LLMs and, you know, what we call AI. I personally think that's funny that we're having these conversations, because we sit through our CPDs, we read the blog posts, we go on the courses telling us about how wonderful AI is and how it can make our lives easier. We then kind of feed that back to the children because that's what we are being told is, you know, the truth. Use this AI. I'm going to teach you how to use this AI. It will make your life easier. And then we need to have conversations about whether using AI, like we've taught them to, constitutes cheating or not. And I think that's something that we really have to think about is, you know, are we ourselves creating a culture where we are being hypocritical with these children because we are showing them we are telling them to use these tools, we're showing them how to use these tools, and then expecting them not to. I was thinking actually about this just yesterday. Day before, I don't know, the days are starting to blend together, but recently. And I was kind of thinking about LLMs as a kind of natural progression step from things like Google Translate. So in case you don't know, in case you are new to Saturday Breakfast, in case you have just stumbled across me this morning, I'm a language teacher. And at no point in my career have I ever told a student that using Google Translate or any of the other online translator tools is a good idea. And in fact, I've taught lessons on why it's not a good idea. You know, we've been through the fact that the children don't speak the language well enough to be able to proofread what has come out of the translator and know whether there are mistakes or not. I tell the story of the student who did a typo in a sentence that he put into Google Translate, and he wrote wasp instead of was. And so randomly in this piece of French homework, there was a sentence that didn't have a verb in it, but it really weirdly had the word guep. And of course, he didn't spot that because he kind of just blindly trusted what the computer was outputting for him. And I think it's ironic, quite honestly, that in the language community, we have all railed against the online translators. We've all taught those lessons about why you shouldn't use them. And yet we also are attending these CPDs about why the large language models are the best thing ever to have hit teaching. But anyway, that's a tangent that I told you I wouldn't go on. So I apologize for that. But this is what has made me think about cheating. over the past few weeks, because I've been thinking about where that line is between us showing our young people how to use these models. You know, maybe you're a computer science teacher and you've been showing children how Claude can help with coding. Maybe you are a maths teacher and you have been using whatever lovely mathsy AI exists to show them how to do complex differential equations. Get me sounding like I know math stuff. Maybe you are a music teacher and you have been getting them to use AI to create their own songs. So maybe you've been embracing it because that's something that we've been told to do. But then when it comes to actually assessing them, and when it comes to giving them homework, and when it comes to giving them tasks to do in the classroom where we want to check their knowledge, we then get frustrated with them, angry with them. We consider it to be cheating because they're using the tools that we've equipped them with. So I don't think that we can roll this back, honestly. I think even if as a profession, we were to kind of everybody jump on the same side that I'm on and go, no, this is bad, we shouldn't be using these things. We're not at this point going to stop our young people from using them in the same way that in language teaching, we haven't been able to stop children from using translators. What we've had to do is reconsider what kind of tasks we set, when and why, in order to limit that. So, for example, to me, in my head, it seems obvious that setting a writing task as a homework is a good idea because writing tasks take time. It's not an efficient use of class time because, you know, the child is going to sit and they are going to write. And if I'm there, they might be too reliant on me to give them conjugated verbs, to give them vocabulary. They might waste a lot of time asking me questions that they don't actually need to ask me instead of sitting down and getting on with it. And so, you know, if I said, right, your 30-minute French homework this week is to write me 75 words on what you did last weekend, and I know that you can do that because I've just taught you how to say, le week-end dernier, je suis allé au parc pour jouer au foot avec mon frère. You can do that independently at home. The problem is that the children started going onto a translator, typing in English their lovely paragraph about, oh, last weekend I went to Gibraltar by plane with my best friend who has spent the last 15 years in a prison in Germany because he was caught shoplifting a chocolate bar at the age of 2. And then I have this very, I'm given this very bizarre story that is demonstrating complex pieces of grammar that I haven't taught them yet, complex pieces of vocabulary that I know they haven't looked up for themselves in the dictionary because they have used the conjugated form instead of the infinitive, which is what happens when they look it up in the dictionary, or they've used a particularly difficult adjective correctly. You know, they've written that it's un bel homme instead of un beau homme, and they shouldn't know that yet. And so, you know, there are all of these giveaways that show me that they haven't actually done the work themselves. So I then had to turn around and start going, right, okay, for your homework, you are going to start doing listening tasks. And we can do that now because, you know, I can put the MP3 on our VLE and you can access it that way. And we're going to do our writing in class because that way I can keep an eye on you and make sure that you're not cheating. Not an efficient use of time, not an efficient use of time at all, because I would rather do the listening in class because listening is actually one of the hardest skills to do. And there's a lot of explicit skills teaching that I can do while I'm getting them to do those activities. But I've had to switch around the way that I do things to limit that cheating. what never really occurred to me is that I could just change the way that I set the tasks, change the way that I design what I'm asking the children to do to limit those opportunities for cheating. And that's what I want to talk about today. So again, as I have already said, if you want to join in the conversation today, please do. Just drop me a message, both on X and on YouTube, wherever you are listening from. I will pop you up on the screen, and we can have a chat, because as always, I'm really interested in what you have to say, as well as what I have to say and what I've been reading. So we know generally that testing is good for learning. That's something that we're taught during our initial teacher training. It's something that CPDs keep reminding us. It's something that blog posts and LinkedIn posts and everything keep telling us. We know that low stakes testing is good. This idea is very well researched. It's very well supported with the research that has happened. And there are lots of different terms for it. Some research, particularly in the US, will call it the testing effect. Sometimes we will call it retrieval practice, because let's be honest, that's what retrieval practice is. It's that low stakes testing. Sometimes we might call it test enhanced learning, which is one that I'd never come across before until I started reading a lot more literature on this to sort of design this show. But the evidence behind it is very, very strong. There are decades of studies that look at different ages, different subjects, different settings, and they all point in that same direction, that when we get our children to retrieve things from memory, they remember it better in the long run than if they just reread it. It stands to reason. Again, it's one of those things that feels like common sense, but it's good to have research to support that common sense. Otherwise, we're just going on what we feel is correct. We're going on our gut feeling. And I'm not entirely sure that you can base pedagogy on gut feeling, given how different all of our cohorts are, how different all of our teaching styles are. And the reason that this works is all to do with those cognitive connections that we're making. So when you force your brain to retrieve something, you're doing a lot more cognitive work than when you just passively absorb it. So that extra effort is the thing that strengthens that memory trace. And this is quite often called desirable difficulty, which is a term as a linguist that I love, because we've got that kind of oxymoronic structure there. Because let's be honest, is difficulty ever really desirable? Don't answer that yet, because that's something that we'll talk about in a couple of minutes' time. That word desirable then is doing a lot of heavy lifting, because difficulty by design is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be hard. That is the point. It wouldn't be called difficulty if it wasn't difficult. But the research kind of gives us a much broader category for this kind of thing. So desirable difficulties are, or desirable difficulty is an umbrella term for things like spaced repetition, for things like retrieval practice, where I am doing my do now, my starter, whatever we're calling it these days, is about something that I taught a fortnight ago. It could be things like not cramming all of your revision for your test the night before, but spacing it out over a 3-week period. It is things like generating your own answers rather than being told them. One of my favorite activities ever is when I teach reflexive verbs, particularly in French and German, where I will just put a whole list of reflexive verbs up on the board. So, for example, Je me lève, I get myself up. Je me lave, I wash myself. Je me rase, I shave myself. And I just put the French or the German or, whichever language I happen to be teaching that have reflexive verbs up on the board. And I ask the children to spot the pattern. And inevitably, somebody is going to see that they've all got the word me in them. And I ask them to guess what me means. And somebody thinks they're being funny when they say me. And I then kind of take the wind out of their sails by saying, well, actually, yes, kind of. It means myself. And that then is that opening up of what reflexive verbs are and why we use them, and how in French and in German, they're actually a lot more prevalent than they are in English, and, all that good languagey stuff. But the point of that activity is to get them pattern spotting, because if they can then see that all of these sentences have got a m in it, and so there is something very clearly going on with that m, or that mich in German, then they're going to remember that much better than if I just stood up at my board and told them. And again, I'm kind of sitting here teaching Granny to suck eggs because we know that this is the right thing to do. We know that discovery learning, getting children to come to their own conclusions, getting them to have their own ideas, their own opinions, is the right thing to do. But the reason it's the right thing to do is because it introduces this desirable difficulty. It actually gets them to do something. It gets their brains moving. It gets them thinking. It gets their synapses firing. It works the brain. And that's what we are wanting them to do. And again, the testing effect, that retrieval practice piece, is one of the most well evidenced of all of the different kind of desirable difficulties that we have. It's the one that has made it most prominently into the teaching guides, into the CPD sessions, into the classroom practice. I think 2, 3, 4 years ago, you couldn't go to a CPD without somebody mentioning retrieval practice. And that has carried on. And the reason that it's carried on, the reason it wasn't a flash in the pan fad like we quite often have, is because it works. Because it does do what we want it to do. But this is where things start to get really interesting, because you will know from the low stakes testing you've done in your classroom. So maybe, you're a linguist, as I am, and you've done a vocabulary test. Maybe you are a year 3 teacher and you are regularly doing your spellings on a Tuesday morning. Maybe you teach history and you have done a quick retrieval practice test on linking names and dates. I don't know, we've all done it. We've all done this low stakes testing. And we know that students don't like it. And what we now know from this little mini series we've been doing on exams and testing here on a Saturday morning is that student responses can range from the slumped shoulders, oh, do we have to, can't we do something fun, right through to actual anxiety, feelings of stress, through to school avoidance, as we talked about last week. So we know full well that introducing desirable difficulty in terms of low stakes testing for a lot of our young people is not desirable at all, and can in fact have the opposite impact to the one that we want it to have. And sometimes we realize that our young people are not playing fair. Sometimes we realize that the phone is out under the desk. It didn't actually go into the pouch at all. A fake phone went into the pouch. Sometimes we notice that surreptitious glance to the paper of the person next to them. And this is the kind of thing that Kristen Wenzel and Wenzel Reinhard at the University of Kassel were investigating in their paper on cheating and task design and desirable difficulty. This is a 2020 paper that was published in the journal called Social Psychology of Education. And it asked a question that I was surprised hadn't really been asked before. And it was, could the negative feelings that children have when they are faced with desirable difficulty actually push students towards teaching? Towards cheating. And I think the reason that had never been asked before is because it's another one of those common sense things, isn't it? You're going to be sitting there going, well, of course it is. Children don't like to fail. Children don't want to fail. So, yeah, they're going to cheat. But again, just because something is common sense doesn't mean it's true. And the good thing about turning to the research to check these things is that we can see whether these patterns are broad or not, whether, to use the term that I quite often use when defending my thesis to people, is this a me problem or is it an us problem? And I think that's what research is really, really useful for. And this is also something that we forget. Linking back to what we were saying before about, what do we do when we finished our degree, when we finished our advanced degrees? What do we do with that? We investigate things that are generally seen as being common sense, but that haven't been investigated yet. Because until they're investigated, it's kind of a me problem rather than being an us problem.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Okay, so the next thing that I want to do is spend a couple of minutes touching on this concept of desirable difficulty, because I do think it's worth exploring in a bit more depth. So before we move on to the Wenzel and Reinhard paper, I want to talk about a chapter that I read by Bjork and Bjork. I love it when clearly married people publish together, because I always think it's funny just to have the same surname twice. And they published this chapter called Making Things Hard on Yourself, but in a Good Way, Creating Desirable Difficulties to Enhance Learning. So Elizabeth Bjork and Robert Bjork, they are from the University of California in LA. And they basically started to pick apart this idea of the differences between learning and performance, which again is something that I've talked about on the show before, because performance is quite often one of those false proxies for learning. We quite often feel good about ourselves when children perform really, really well, when they get 10 out of 10 on their vocab test or whatever it might be. But you can perform education, you can perform a list of exercises from your exercise book without actually having learned anything. And Bjork and Bjork here kind of start to pick that idea apart. And they reference latent learning experiments from, decades ago, where mice and other animals were given periods of free exploration in a maze. And when they were just exploring the maze, they seemed aimless in their explanation. They were just having a bit of a wander. But once rewards were introduced, they were shown to have undertaken considerable learning. They knew how to navigate the maze once there was a reason to navigate it, once the bit of cheese was put in the middle, or whatever it might be. More recently, though, a variety of experiments have demonstrated that the reverse is true. And again, this is what Bjork and Bjork talk about in this chapter. They talk about how substantial improvements in performance across practice sessions, across training sessions, can happen without any kind of significant learning, which is revealed after a delay or a change in context. Because remember, when learning happens, you are still going to be able to do the thing a month later, 2 months later. You are going to be able to do the thing in a different context. If in German you have learnt your present tense and you know that it's ich spiele, du spielst, er sie, es, man spielt. And you can do that when I just give you the list of infinitives and I ask you to conjugate them for different people in that kind of one-off exercise that comes after I've been through the words on the conjugations with you on the whiteboard. You have performed the present tense then. You have shown me that after I've literally just told it to you, you can do it. You've shown me that you were listening while I was up at the board, which I appreciate. If the week after I ask you to write a paragraph in the present tense using the verbs that follow the rule and only the verbs that follow the rule, and you get it wrong, then you haven't learnt it. All you did when you did it in that first week was perform it. And that's what Bjork and Bjork are getting at here. This idea that learning and performance are different. And let's be honest, we do quite often treat performance as if it is learning, and we've got to be very careful that we don't do that. So Bjork and Bjork themselves, at a theoretical level, look at the difference between what they call storage strength and retrieval strength of information. So storage strength is about how entrenched or interassociated a memory representation is with the knowledge or the skills that are trying to be acquired. Whereas retrieval strength is the activation or accessibility of that representation when it is situated within cues or exposure or recency of study. And basically what they have come to suggest is that, I'm just double checking my notes here to make sure that I get this the right way around. Current performance strength is completely a function of current retrieval strength, and storage strength then acts to stop the forgetting and enhance the relearning of that retrieval strength. So basically what they're saying is that conditions that most rapidly increase retrieval strength are different to the conditions that maximize storage strength. And so if your learners are interpreting current retrieval strength as storage strength, then they start to prefer these poorer conditions of learning as opposed to the better ones. So our learners can quite easily trick themselves into thinking that they've learned something when in fact they're just short-term memory getting it down on paper. They then don't like it when they are tested on it a few weeks later because it proves to them that they haven't learnt it like they thought they did. And there are conversations that we can have around this and how that impacts learner identity, who you think you are as a learner, how you perceived yourself as a learner, because maybe you thought that you were somebody who had learnt the present tense in French, because when Mr. Lester gave you 10 verbs to conjugate in the I form, you got them all right. You knew it was je vais, and you know it's je joue, and you know it's je mange. But then when you walk into that lesson a couple of weeks later and you know it's going to be about the present tense and you feel really confident because you think you learnt that, and you then can't do it because you didn't learn it, you were just short-term memory retrieving it, that impacts how you then feel about your abilities as a French learner. So Bjork and Bjork then ask this question: what are these better conditions of learning that, yes, create difficulty, but they lead to learning that is more durable and more flexible? And actually, this term desirable difficulties was coined by one of the Bjorks in 1994. And it involves varying that condition of learning. So we're not going to keep it constant. We're not going to keep it predictable, which is interesting because there's a lot to be said for predictability of tasks and task routine, because we can spend a lot of, or we can waste a lot of time explaining how to do a specific type of task. And so it does just get a bit easier if your children walk in and they know that their do it now is going to be exactly the same thing every single day, because they can just sit down and get on with it. But that's not necessarily the best thing for helping them to learn. And it's not necessarily retrieval practice, because it's not testing them on these things in different contexts, under different circumstances. So what we need to do when we're thinking about desirable difficulty is really focus on this word desirable. We need to think about how we can design our tasks so that the children actually want to test themselves, so that they want to check that they have done the right thing, so that they don't want to pull out their phones and cheat. And that's going to be the hardest part of this whole conversation, isn't it? Because if we knew how to do that, and we knew how to do that consistently, we wouldn't be needing to have this conversation, because it would be baked into our textbooks, it would be baked into our CPD, it would be baked into our teacher training. But it's by having these difficult conversations and by going, okay, this is not something that we do regularly as a profession, this is not part of my practice, how can I make it part of my practice? This is how we move forward. This is how we get better as a profession. This is how we create education that sticks. But there is a dark side to this desirable difficulty, because I spent the last 20 minutes or so talking about how great it is, talking about why we need it, why we need to get those neurons firing. But it's not all good, particularly from the point of view of our learners. Because this word desirable is coming from the perspective of learner outcome, from our perspective. Because we know that the children need to challenge themselves in order to progress. We know that they need to go through this difficulty to get better. We know that we went through that difficulty and we came out of it the other side better in our subject, and in fact good enough to teach it, or even better in the subjects we chose not to teach because maybe they weren't our best subjects or the subjects we were most interested in, but we still went through those difficulties and we can still do the things. I can still work out the area of a circle when I need to. I can still use Pythagoras' theorem when I need to. I went through that desirable difficulty and I can still do it now. It's not something that I use on a daily basis, and I'm not going to pretend that it is, not in the same way that I use verb conjugations on a daily basis. But it is something that I can still do 20 something years after doing my GCSE in maths, which is when I left my maths study behind, because I went through those desirable difficulties, because I had that spaced repetition, because I had that retrieval, and it embedded itself into my long-term memory. But from the perspective of our students who are sitting in the classroom in that moment, and we say, right, vocab test time, put your books away, get your pencils out, get your pens out, here's your little sheet of paper. That's when things for the student can start to fall apart. Now, we did a whole show on this a few weeks ago about test anxiety and the very seemingly extreme emotional reactions that some people can have towards testing. And it has been proven, again, by quite a lot of data, quite a lot of research, that there are lots of children who fall apart the minute you tell them they are going to be tested. So again, this is why we need to think very carefully about our task design in order to mitigate those responses. But Wenzel and Reinhard also point this out in the introduction to their paper. They point to this growing body of evidence that suggests that difficult learning tasks, not just tests, but any kind of difficult learning task, will produce a whole cluster of negative experiences. It will produce stress, anxiety, frustration, feelings of pressure. And yes, in some children, it will produce feelings of, I can't be bothered. It's Friday, period 5, and I just don't want to do my vocabulary test. I don't want to write 200 words analyzing the theme of grief in Camus' work. I just don't want to. And, all of those feelings are equally valid because all of those feelings are being experienced. It doesn't actually matter whether a child is having an anxiety reaction to the task that you've just set or a laziness reaction to it. The fact is they are both having negative reactions to the task that you have put in front of them. And that then, as we know, leads to a very negative evaluation of the learning situation itself. Now, when we talk about negative evaluation, what we mean is the overall impression that our young people have of these learning opportunities that we are giving them. And they are the questions that the children will ask themselves as they are going through a task. Was this task fair? And again, if you are a primary teacher especially, you will know the importance of fairness. You will know that young children have a very strong sense of justice. And if you can present something as being fair, they are more likely to buy into it than if they perceive that it's not fair and you can't justify otherwise. They might ask, was it appropriate? Does this actually test things that I have been learning? And of course, what a child thinks is appropriate is not necessarily the same as what we think is appropriate. I might know that it's appropriate to test my GCSE Japanese class on the te form of the verb 2 weeks after I taught it, because that's retrieval practice. But they might not think that that's appropriate. I emphasized the wrong word there. They might not think that that's appropriate because 2 weeks have passed and they're going, oh, well, we've moved on to a different topic now. Why are you not testing us on this? And again, we need to think carefully about how we are designing and explaining our tasks to kind of mitigate that. And I do think explaining the reason for a task can go a long way towards that. I think, and I know that I've done it myself, there have been times where I've given a task that I know has been for retrieval practice or, whatever it might be, but I haven't explained it. And when they've asked, or when they've said, this isn't fair, we haven't studied this in 2 weeks, my response has been something like, well, if you've learnt it, then you'll be all right. Whereas what I probably should have said was, I know that we learnt this 2 weeks ago, but testing it now will show us whether you have learnt it or not, and will show us whether or not you need to revise it. And I think, sometimes as teachers, it's very easy for us just to be like, this is what I'm asking you to do, so please go and do it. And kind of not doing that emotional labor to explain why we're doing something, to explain why a particular task that we've designed is important. And sometimes maybe we don't want to cultivate that habit because when we have been running low on time and we're just doing a very quick textbook lesson because we didn't have time to very deliberately think about what we were doing, and we just know this lesson has worked before, we know what's on the next page, so we're going to do it. Maybe we don't want them asking that question so that we don't have to say, oh, well, actually, sorry, I ran out of time to plan your lesson, so we're just doing something from the textbook. But maybe if we actually explain why we are doing these desirably difficult tasks, our young people might be more inclined to be on board with them because they will understand why they are important in the educational process. We've moved beyond the concept of, I'm the teacher, I'm telling you to do this, and so you should do it. And we've rightfully moved beyond that. But we don't always put it into practice, I think. So Wenzel and Reinhard used a 10-item scale. Lots of these papers that we've been talking about lately in terms of assessment and testing have used the 10-point scale. It seems to be a very popular one in this particular domain of research. And their scale covered everything from perceived difficulty of task through to strenuousness, through to feelings of injustice, feelings of lack of appropriateness in the task design. And the students who take tests, so these students who were asked their opinions, the students who are tested as part of their retrieval practice, tend to evaluate the learning situation more negatively than students who are just given something to read. And again, we know this is common sense. Tests feel harder, they feel less pleasant than just reading through a page in the textbook. But the research shows this empirically. It shows that this is an us problem rather than a me problem. The question we have to ask, though, is, does this matter? Does how our students perceive the difficulty of the task, the unpleasantness of the task, matter beyond, oh, they just haven't liked my lesson today? And the answer to that is yes, because it can be those negative feelings that make them more likely to cheat. And when thinking about this, interestingly, Wenzel and Reinhard call on two theories from criminology. And I love this because I love interdisciplinary work and the idea that as teachers, we can draw on all sorts of different theories to kind of figure out what is going on in the heads of our young people as we are trying to get them to learn. I think that's really exciting. And the two theories that they looked at are rational choice theory and strain theory. And what they do is they kind of weave them together to give us a really cool lens to understand what is going on in the minds of our students when they are sitting in their difficult test, doing their difficult homework, and it's not going well. So rational choice theory, as far as I understand it, and again, I'm a linguist, I'm not a criminologist, so this is just me kind of interpreting it as I have read it in the research, means that people tend to weigh up the cost and benefit of an action before deciding whether to do it. So again, kind of common sense, but it has a name. So when a student thinks about cheating, when they think about getting ChatGPT to write their 150-word Chinese homework for them, when they think about using a calculator on a practice non-calculator paper, they are looking at what do I gain versus what can I possibly lose? Are the better grades, less effort, a more impressive result more important than the risk of getting caught, my own guilty feelings, a compromise of my self-image? If I consider myself to be someone who doesn't cheat, but I'm a perfectionist, I'm a high achiever, I'm looking at this A-level philosophy question, and I don't think I'm going to get an A on it because I don't really understand what the question is actually asking me. So am I going to risk, is it better, I suppose, for me to cheat on this homework and just plagiarize something that has gotten an A for somebody else so that I can still protect my self-image of a student who gets A's? And is that better than the risk of my teacher finding out that I plagiarized or my teacher giving me a B. Now, normally, the cost is going to outweigh the benefits for most students most of the time. But negative emotion can shift their cost benefit analysis. So they can reduce how worried students might be about getting caught. They can increase that perceived importance of those benefits. So again, getting a good grade for a perfectionist student might feel a lot more urgent when they are stressed, when they feel like they're struggling. And they can then increase the rationalization, the justification of cheating in order to make it feel acceptable. And it's that last part that connects really nicely to strain theory. So strain theory argues that dishonest behavior increases when people are experiencing negative emotional stress, negative emotional states, that are produced by stressful circumstances. And strain theory actually has really specific triggers that it identifies for this. So there is the failure to achieve the positive outcomes that you expected. There is the experience of something as unfair or unjust. And there is the feeling of a situation being beyond your control. And now, I don't know about you, but for me, I think if we were to strip away that criminology language, that's a really good description of how a lot of our students feel when they are struggling through a really difficult homework, through a really difficult test, especially if they didn't fully prepare, especially if they don't understand why the difficulty is actually necessary for their learning. If we've kind of fobbed them off with, oh, well, your exam might be hard, or, oh, well, doing something hard makes you learn, which is kind of a half explanation, but it doesn't fully go into it. It's not convincing enough as an explanation to keep our young people on board. So, and importantly, strain theory predicts that the emotions feeding this aren't just fear of failure, but it's things that are specifically connected to perceived unfairness. So when students feel that their learning situation is unjust, if they're feeling hard done by, then that sense of injustice becomes almost like psychological permission to bend the rules, to cheat. And this is where it gets really pointed for us. Because Wenzel and Reinhard are highlighting something that really should make us stop and think, okay, what is going on within my practice? What's going on within my classroom and with these students? And it's that most of our young people fully believe that easy, fluent learning is more effective than difficult learning. So we've kind of got that cognitive dissonance between what we know to be good learning, which is pushing through that desirable difficulty, and what our children think is good learning, which is sitting and highlighting their textbook. And most children, if you ask them, they will tell you that just highlighting the textbook is not a good revision strategy. They will tell you that they would rather do a past paper. But the research is showing that they don't actually believe that as a cohort, by and large. And again, a lot of the reason for that is we don't explain it to them. Metacognition was a big talking point in schools, 3 years ago? I remember one of the last inset days that I had in my previous brick and mortar school before I went fully online was about metacognition and getting our children to think about their thinking. But this isn't something, certainly in my practice and in what I've observed, that we are talking to our children about very often. We quite often don't tell them that they need to get through this difficulty. They need to get through this hard retrieval practice in order to learn. And so what they will do is they think that you are setting them a difficult task because you're a strict teacher, because you just want them to fail. They are not seeing the positives because no one is teaching them about the positives. That also means that instead of actually engaging with the task, they are just sitting there thinking, well, this isn't fair. This has got nothing to do with what we were doing. This topic is from 2 weeks ago. I need to learn the thing that we are doing now. Because that's the other misconception that young people often have, is that learning is just about exposure to new material. And they think that the best thing that they can do is just every single lesson have something that is brand new. But we know, because we've done the reading, we've done the research, we've been to the CPD, we know full well that that is not learning, that's just blasting through a curriculum. But if we don't explain that to the children, then they don't know it. And I think that it's really important for us to consider how deliberate we are in explaining our task design to our young people. Because these techniques that we are using, because we know that they improve learning, may in fact be hindering learning because the children don't understand why they're important, which means the children are not engaging with them in the way that we want them to engage. And so then you have to ask, well, what was the point? Because we've wasted a perfectly good learning opportunity.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Okay, so let's look then at what this study actually found. I am not going to walk you through the methodology of the study like I usually do, because we are running low on time. And if you're interested, you can go and find the study and you can read it, you can see the methodology. We're actually going to skip straight to the interpretation of it. And that is essentially that maintaining a positive self-concept requires us to feel that the moral logic that we're applying to ourselves is consistent. And so, you know, it's things like, if I say that cheating is wrong, and I then cheat because I am perceiving the task as being more difficult, I am going to feel more negatively both about that task and about the subject, maybe about the teacher. And so because I've attacked my own self, my own identity really, by going, well, I'm somebody that doesn't cheat, but this is unfair, this is too hard, I'm going to have to. I don't have a choice. My teacher hasn't given me a choice. I'm going to feel much, much worse about that teacher. And I think we've got a lot to consider in there. We've got a lot to consider about our own students' identity, their perception of their own identity, and how we can help them to be people who believe that they don't cheat, while also being people who don't cheat. Now, we haven't actually talked very much about cheating. So let's, because that is kind of the crux of the show today. That's the point of the issue that we are discussing. And I do think it is worth taking a step back from this study to think about academic dishonesty, because the study kind of sits within a massive landscape of research, and some of the findings that we've got are actually quite scary. The paper cites an American survey where 74% of students reported seriously cheating on at least one test, and over 30% of their students admitted to repeated serious cheating. Now, obviously, this is self-reported data, so there are limitations here. And this is in an American context where kind of in-class testing, in-class assignments have a bit more weight because they lead to the GPA system. They impact whether or not a student will actually graduate from their high school. But it is sobering, I think, to know that, again, 74% of students reported seriously cheating. And these are the ones who were comfortable to self-report on cheating or who interpreted their behavior as cheating. I wonder how many students weren't comfortable with saying, yes, I've cheated. And conversely, I wonder how many students think they cheated when they actually didn't. Because I've had that. I've had children tell me that they cheated in a homework. And when I asked them to explain how, they said it was because they used a dictionary. And I sort of had to say, well, I didn't say that you couldn't use a dictionary. There was nothing in the task precluding you from doing that. So, don't worry, you're fine. And again, that was more on my part for not being very explicit about how I designed the task. And I remember that student very clearly, because from then on, I put it in my task template that there was always a you may or you may not use a dictionary line, depending on whether I wanted them to or not. In a UK context, Ofqual and other higher education bodies have reported ongoing concerns about academic misconduct and that rise of contract cheating. So again, if you've ever tried to Google past papers, because they're not available anymore, maybe you wanted one from a few years ago, whatever it might be, you have probably found that there are all sorts of organizations out there that you can pay to complete your past paper for you. Maybe while you were at uni, you encountered some of those essay writing companies that exist. Maybe while you've been job hunting, you've seen adverts for, essay writers needed. You need at least a bachelor's degree in this subject, because they are everywhere. And that has added a whole new dimension to this issue of cheating. And again, this has then in turn become more complex with the addition of AI, which can produce essays on demand, essentially for free. And we need to very carefully, as we have done over the last hour and a bit, consider what drives that cheating. The research tells us that it's rarely about laziness. It can be. The research doesn't preclude that. And again, I think it's important for us to not pathologize everything. Not everything is about anxiety. Not everything is about perfectionism. Not everything is even about not having enough time and prioritizing other subjects. Sometimes it is just, I want to go out and play football with my mates, so I'm going to very quickly get ChatGPT to write this essay for me, and then I'll go out and play. And it's important to know that all of these things exist within our classrooms. For some students, it is the anxiety. For some students, it is the desire to go out and play. But the factors that come up most consistently in the research on cheating include fear of failure, pressure from parents or peers, high stakes assessment culture, which is something we are very guilty of here in the UK. Even though our in-class assessments rarely count for anything, we have a high stakes assessment culture because of our endpoint exams and because everything rests on those endpoint exams. Unmanageable workloads. If we don't, or if no one has taught our young people how to manage their time effectively, because I'm not entirely sure that is completely a school's responsibility. perceptions that the teacher or the school or whatever is being unfair. And again, most critically, most crucially, the rationalization that allows a student to maintain a positive self-image while still cheating. The thought process that occurs that says, yeah, I've got the AI to write my essay for me, but that's not cheating because my teacher has taught me how to use AI to do my research. And that's just the same thing. You know, if we're not careful, the very lessons that many teachers are teaching to get them to use these tools for whatever reason they might be using them will come back to bite us. Again, an example from my own practice is I kind of lied to you earlier when I said that I'd never known a language teacher who advocated for online translators, because that's not entirely true. I did know one person who she didn't like the translators, not for, you know, great big long complex sentences and paragraphs, but she didn't mind them being used as dictionaries for kind of one word just checking when it was faster than getting up and using the paper dictionary. But that very quickly in those classes spiraled into using the translator, going from one word to a couple of words, then a couple of words to a sentence, then a sentence to a paragraph. And, you know, just gradually, the comfort that the child felt with using that translator ramped up. And the justification was, sorry, miss, you told us that we could use it, so I used it. And they kind of don't remember that you said it was okay to use it for one word. They don't remember that you said it was okay to use the LLM to plan your essay, but don't get it to write your essay. They don't remember that you said it was okay to get the LLM to do the research and then you write the essay. They hear it's okay to use the LLM. And even if they remember that you put boundaries on it, the fact that you said it was okay to use it in the first place makes it easier to justify using it outside of those boundaries. Makes it easier to go, well, Mr. Lester said that I could use it, and he set me this really hard, unfair task, so I'm just going to use the tool that he gave me. And from a moral psychology perspective, I think this is really important for us to keep in mind, because our children who cheat, however we're going to define cheating, don't think of themselves as cheaters. They think that what they have done is an isolated response to an extreme circumstance. And so if the learning environment that they're in consistently produces those extreme circumstances, then we've got this persistent psychological permission to keep cheating. Now, please don't get me wrong. I am not saying that retrieval practice, that testing produces cheating as an automatic response. I'm not saying that it's inevitable. That's not what the research says. That's not what I believe. I just think it's really important, I suppose, and this is where the task design element of the show comes in, to be very deliberate about how we are designing tasks and to be very honest with our young people about why the content of that task is coming up now. I taught you the te form of the verb 2 weeks ago. We've moved on since then, and we've been working on our adjectives and conjugating our adjectives, because that's something that we do in Japanese. But today I'm giving you a test on the te form of the verb, because I want to see if you have remembered it. You need to see if you have learnt it, and that means being able to still use it 2 weeks later. And that's why we are doing this task. And If you don't do as well on this task as you might have done, that shows us that you need to go back over the TED form. We need to revise it. We need to keep practicing it. If you do very well on this task, then it means that we need to look at how we can put the TED form fluently, naturally into your writing without thinking. And I think it's about having these very honest conversations with our young people about what our individual tasks are designed to do. And I think this comes back to my little obsession that I have with deliberate practice. And that everything that we do in the classroom should be done for a very specific reason. Because we all know that we don't have enough time. We all know that we've got too much content to cover in the little amount of curriculum time that we have. And so if we can be very deliberate with how we are designing our tasks, and we can be very explicit with our young people about why they are being designed in a certain way, we can tell them what we are expecting, we can explain to them why it's fair, and we can mitigate all of those negative feelings that might start bubbling up. That's when we might be able to mitigate any desire for cheating. And maybe I can go back to setting my writing as homework instead of doing it in task, because that would be a better use of homework versus contact time. Anyway, I hope that you have found today's show interesting. I always hope that. I hope that you are able to take something away about the kind of explicitness of designing a task. I'm sorry if you tuned in thinking that I was going to take you through how we can design a task specifically. But I think kind of as I've been going through the show today, as we've been talking, maybe I've realized myself that all task design can be done to limit the cheating. What we just have to do is be careful with our instructions and be very explicit on about telling the children why we have designed the task. So maybe it's less about what the body of the task is and more about what we write in that instructions paragraph, so that they know and so that they understand. I hope you all have a great week. If you are back to school after half term this week, I hope it goes well. We are almost at the summer, so keep going. Please do stay tuned to TTR because we have lots of exciting shows coming up for you over the week. So I look forward to seeing lots of you in the comments on other people's shows. And if I don't see you over on other shows, I will see you next Saturday morning for our breakfast. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.